Hi, beautiful people. Welcome to the Fort Salem Library, where we read you your fanfiction. So sit down or don't, relax or don't, and enjoy these stories in a way you have not before. We at Fort Salem Library do not own Motherland Fort Salem or any of the related characters. The Motherland Fort Salem series is created by Elliot Lawrence and owned by Freeform. This story is a work of fanfiction and is meant for entertainment only. We are not making any profit from these stories. All rights of the original Motherland Fort Salem story belong to Freeform. We also do not own All Secrets Keep or any of its original characters and storylines. We did, however, get permission from the author to read their story. This story was created and written by Lisbeth_1, and you can find the link in our show notes. This story is being read to you by Celine.
All Secrets Keep, Chapter 16. A touch, feather light, ghosted over Sarah's ribs, and she felt goosebumps erupt in its wake as her eyes slowly opened. In the low light of the morning, her vision was filled with red hair, mussed from both sex and sleep. The touch was traced against her skin again, the exact same spot, and Sarah squirmed lightly. The touch halted, and the red hair blocking her view shifted until Tally was looking directly at her, brown eyes wide. "I'm sorry. Did I wake you?" "Yes," Sarah rasped out, voice still hoarse from sleep. Tally smiled at the sound, scooting slightly closer to Sarah. "Sorry," she said again, but she traced her fingers against Sarah's ribs again as she said it. "What is this from? I didn't think you could scar, 'cause of the biddies." Sarah glanced down to where Tally's pointer finger was dragging lightly against her skin, against the silvery scar that cut diagonally across her lower rib cage. "No, but that is from before I ever had biddies." Tally's eyes shot up to her, wide, as if she hadn't ever considered that to be a possibility. "So, what is this from?" "From the very first war I ever fought in." Sarah reached up to smooth some of Tally's wild hair. "I had no fixes with me then, so it had to heal the old-fashioned way, leaving a scar." Tally looked down at the scar curiously, and then, without saying anything, leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to it. The softness of the gesture took Sarah by surprise, and she looked up at the ceiling, trying to swallow the lump that appeared in her throat, as Tally lifted her head only to press another, equally gentle kiss along the length of the scar, hand stroking softly against Sarah's side. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she had been touched with such care, such love, like she was something to be treasured and not just a pawn to be used in someone else's war. Tally looked up, grinning, completely unaware of the effect her actions had just had on Sarah. "Sometimes I remember how long you have lived and count myself so incredibly lucky that you fell in love with someone like me." Sarah rolled over onto her side so she could properly look at Tally. "Someone like you," she echoed. "Yeah, Tally bit her lip, shrugging. Her hand was resting on Sarah's bare hip. "I'm just me. She pursed her lips, trying to think of a word. "Ordinary." Sarah's eyes softened, and she reached out to stroke Tally's cheek. "There is nothing about you that is ordinary, my love." Tally's eyes dropped, and a flush crawled up her upper chest, spreading to her cheeks. "You're too sweet for words sometimes, you know that?" "Is that so?" Sarah teased. She reached out and took one of Tally's hands with her own, threading their fingers together. "Yeah, Rael thinks so too." Tally then crinkled her nose. I wasn't supposed to tell you that. Sarah's eyebrows rose. Collar thinks I'm sweet. Can you blame her? Tally looked up at Sarah again, a smile on her face. It's not like you exactly hid how you felt about me when she was in the room with us before you left for The Hague. Sarah's thumb was stroking soft circles on Tally's hand. It is hard enough for me to hide how I feel for you on a daily basis. I was not going to act like I felt anything less for you than what I truly do, just because your sister was in the room with us. Tally didn't say anything back, but she squeezed Sarah's hand, and then suddenly launched herself forward, lips colliding into Sarah's in a kiss that stole the breath from Sarah's lungs. She pushed Sarah onto her back, climbing on top of her as she did so, still not breaking the kiss. Sarah's hands immediately went up to Tally's waist, steadying her as Tally straddled her hips. Tally slid her tongue into Sarah's mouth, running it along the back of Sarah's teeth, and Sarah let out a low groan. She brought her hand up to Tally's neck, resting it along her collarbone, and pushed the younger woman away from her, slightly. "Tally," she said warningly. Tally straightened only slightly, her fingers curling into Sarah's shoulders, an air of nonchalance about her. "What?" she asked innocently. Sarah resisted the urge to groan as Tally's eyes slid from Sarah's face to stare shamelessly at her breasts, still bare from the night before. "You know what? As much as I would love to, and I would love to," she was quick to assure Tally, "we won't have enough time." "I have," Tally said slowly, with a firm rock of her hips into Sarah's nails digging into her hips with a gasp, "no idea what you're talking about." "Are you really going to try to play innocent right now?" Tally's cheeks turned a light shade of pink. "You want to talk about innocence when we both know where your mouth was last night." In a flash, Sarah had sat up, spinning them both around so Tally was flat on her back, her legs on either side of Sarah's waist. Sarah could feel the heat of Tally's core pressed up against her stomach. She leaned down and bit Tally's earlobe, rasping into it. "You say that like you weren't absolutely begging for my mouth last night." She felt Tally shudder slightly underneath her at her words. Tally turning red as she remembered what happened the previous night. Sarah was right. She had been begging for it. Sarah had teased her past the point of coherency, putting Tally so on edge that she had nearly come undone from the first rough stroke of Sarah's tongue against her clit. "Yeah, well," Tally's voice was strained, stuttering for a retort to Sarah's point. "It's not my fault that you're criminally good in bed." Sarah laughed, rough and low, and she pulled away from Tally's ear to look back at her, only mildly surprised. "You are entirely too precious for words, Tally Craven." Tally glowed at Sarah's words, eyes shining up at Sarah with adoration. "I love you, Sarah." Sarah smiled, the genuine, full smile that was reserved only for Tally's eyes, the one that never failed to take Tally's breath away. "I love you too, sweetheart." Tally felt her presence in the library before she actually saw her. She'd been sitting in the library practically all day ever since she left Sarah's room, cramming for her mother tongue final with an ever-growing headache between her eyes, when she felt Sarah's presence through the link. She looked up, seeing only bookshelves and empty study tables, but she didn't need to see Sarah to know she was there. She could feel her. She found herself wishing the library was completely empty, the whispering and footsteps of other students in the room reminding her that she would have to pretend not to notice Sarah as she walked by. Two of the students standing by a shelf near Tally's table suddenly straightened, standing to attention, and Tally's heart jumped into her throat as Sarah rounded the corner, slowly walking as she always did, her hands behind her back. The two students seemed to make a split-second decision, shoving whatever books they had been holding back onto the shelf, and hurried away into another row. away from the intimidating presence of the general. Sarah stopped in front of Tally's table, far enough away so it didn't look like she was there for Tally specifically, but close enough for her to throw a glance and a soft smile her way, eyes crinkling with a larger smile that she was holding back. Tally felt a thrill rush through her body, her headache easing slightly when Sarah's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before it returned to her eyes. Then Sarah frowned, her head turning slightly at something over Tally's shoulder, and she turned so her body was parallel to Tally's table, grabbing a book off a shelf at random. Tally barely had time to wonder at Sarah's actions when she felt someone come up behind her, and she glanced away from Sarah, who was busy pretending to read whatever book she had just picked up, to look behind her. It was Gregorio, smiling easily at her as he slid into the seat next to her. Tally smiled uncertainly back at him. "How goes the studying?" He pointed to her textbooks and scattered notes. "Probably better than mine." "Oh, it's all right," Tally said truthfully. "I tried to study in the dorm earlier, but Rael and Abigail kept having the same argument about whether or not Rael is going to go to the Christmas ball. Ray doesn't really want to. She would rather go back home early, but Abigail wants all of us to be there." Gregorio coughed nervously, flipping open and shutting the cover of his textbook rapidly. "I actually wanted to talk to you about that." Tally stiffened. "About the ball?" She could feel Sarah's gaze turn away from the book she had been pretending to read to look at her and Gregorio. "Yeah, I was wondering if anybody had asked you to go with them yet." Gregorio flipped the cover shut one more time before turning in his chair to look at Tally fully, completely unaware that Sarah was watching them. "Go with, like, a date?" Tally's voice was suddenly too high, and she was frozen in her seat, staring at Gregorio. "Yeah," he said a little more confidently, his hair shaking a bit as he shook his head in affirmation. "I thought that if nobody had asked you yet, then maybe you would like to go with me?" He offered her a smile that she thought she was probably supposed to find charming. Cadet Craven." Sarah's voice had both cadets jumping in their seats, neither of them having noticed that she had approached the table. The book she had previously been pretending to read was nowhere in sight. "Ma'am?" Tally said nervously, eyes wide, staring at Sarah. "I need to speak with you for a moment." There was an edge to Sarah's voice that Tally hadn't heard directed towards her in months. Not since, well, before Sarah had come back from the dead. Tally wasn't sure what she had done to put it there. Sarah's eyes briefly glanced over to Gregorio, and she raised her eyebrows fractionally. "Oh," Gregorio suddenly stood up, grabbing at his books. "Sorry, General, I just, He glanced at Tally, who was staring down at the table. "Yeah." He took off without another word. Tally heard him go, tilting her head back up to look at Sarah, who was watching him walk away, looking as if she had just tasted something bitter. "Is everything okay?" Sarah sighed suddenly, her tense expression falling, and to Tally's great surprise, she pulled out the chair across the table from Tally and sat down. "I'm sorry. That was unprofessional of me." She didn't look at Tally as she spoke, staring down at her folded hands as she leaned her elbows onto the table. Tally looked back at where Gregorio had taken off, confused. "I don't understand what just—" The words died in her throat as something clicked in her head, and her eyes widened in disbelief, a slight smile crawling onto her face. "Sarah Alder," she whispered in awe, making sure to keep her voice down so no one else would hear them. "Were you jealous?" Sarah looked up at her with a grimace. She didn't say anything. Tally itched to reach out and take Sarah's hands in her own, but she knew she couldn't, not where anyone could walk by and see, so she clenched them together in her lap, leaning across the table. "I wasn't going to say yes," she said softly, reassuringly. Sarah sighed again, lifting a hand to rub at her temple, and she sat up straight. It was unfair of me to interrupt that conversation. Her voice was low, but she kept her gaze locked on Tally's. And it would be even more so for me to expect you to not have a date to the Christmas ball. I cannot take you myself. That does not mean you should have to go alone. Tally let out a quiet huff of disbelief. I would much rather go alone than have someone who isn't you take me. Sarah tilted her head, looking at Tally with exasperated affection. Tally, I don't expect you to deny yourself these sorts of things because of me. I'm not denying myself anything. Tally's voice grew a little too loud, and she winced, glancing around the library. Sarah, I chose to be with you. Her voice was lowered again, leaning further across the table towards the other woman. And being with you is all that matters to me. I don't care if I miss out on having a date to the ball, 'cause to me it's not missing out on anything. I don't want to spend that night with anyone that isn't you, and if I can't spend it with you, then I won't spend it with anyone. Sarah's expression softened from fond exasperation into something far more intimate, and she opened her mouth to say something, but was cut off by the loud chattering of a group of students who were rounding the corner. Sarah immediately stood, turning her back to Tally as she stood facing the bookshelf again, hands going behind her back. Tally sighed, frustrated, and she grabbed all her notes and shoved them into her book. She had had enough of studying for the day. She stood from the table as well, and as she walked by Sarah's hand shot out and grabbed her by the wrist. Okay. It was just a word, just a whisper. Sarah letting go of her wrist as soon as it was spoken, but Tally still heard it, still understood what it meant. Sarah was letting Tally choose her again, letting her choose Sarah over all the little things in life that Tally didn't want, but Sarah thought she should have, all the things that paled in comparison to loving and being loved by Sarah. She bit her lip to hide the smile on her face, and turned slightly to look back at Sarah. Okay? Sarah nodded, still staring at the bookshelf. Okay. Sarah! Sarah! Open the door! The frantic pounding on Sarah's door, combined with the crackle of far speech in her ear, ripped Sarah back to consciousness, dragging her through the fog of sleep clouding her brain almost instantly. She jumped out of bed, not even bothering to get dressed properly. Whoever was bothering her at 3 a.m. surely couldn't be offended by her being in sleepwear, could they? And yanked the door open to reveal a wide-eyed Petra, dressed in combat gear. Any sleepiness that still clouded Sarah's brain was instantly dissipated. Petra? What the hell? Sarah! Petra was looking at her, equal parts determined and worried. You need to go back to the safe house, now! Sarah blinked. Excuse me? Why would I? Petra interrupted her again, almost seemingly determined to not let Sarah get a complete sentence out. The Camarilla are here. The blood turned to ice in Sarah's veins. What? The word was a hiss, low and dangerous. They're tearing buildings apart, looking for you. It's all boots on deck right now. I have a strike team deployed across base fighting back, but you need to go. No. It was Sarah's turn to interrupt Petra, her eyes dark and narrowed. Anger was thawing the ice in her veins, setting her blood alight. I will not sit back and hide while our soldiers, our daughters, risk their lives for me. Under any other circumstance, Petra might have been the slightest bit of intimidated by the anger in Sarah's voice, the anger that was directed at her for even suggesting that Sarah sit out of the fight, but the threat in Sarah's voice was undermined by the fact that she was still in her pajamas, a pair of cotton boxers and a tank top that was ridden slightly up, revealing a strip of muscled stomach. Sarah, they are here to try to kill you, Petra stressed. We cannot let that happen again. Sarah's jaw clenched, and her blue eyes burned with a fury that she had not felt in a long time. Then let them fucking try. Petra had relented, unable to temper Sarah's fury, but not before she assigned a strike team to guard Sarah's back, to watch her every step. Fighting became natural for Sarah again. The adrenaline and rage coursing through her veins was fueled by every whistling swing of her scourge, every crack of thunder that drowned out her yells, or perhaps they were caused by them. She couldn't be sure. The strike team, although probably unnecessary, was welcome assistance in Sarah's fight. It was her first time fighting without the biddies in centuries, and although the strike team was not nearly as well in tune with Sarah as the biddies had been, having several people there to watch her back as she fought helped Sarah more than she thought it would. There was no witch plague this time round, the Bellwether unit having, for now at least, destroyed it all when they launched their own attack on the Camarilla base, and half of the Camarilla members attacking the base and throwing themselves at Petra, Sarah and the witches protecting her weren't even wearing the work-disabling devices. Somewhere in the back of Sarah's mind, something felt off, wrong, but it was overpowered by the rage that was bubbling up inside of her. It wasn't until a call rang out, the sky now a light gray with the sun peeking over the horizon, Sarah's scourge heated and bloody, that the thought of something being wrong, something out of character with this attack, nagged more firmly in the back of her brain. The Camarilla who had been attacking Sarah and Petra suddenly turned on their heel and ran, sprinting towards the forest that lined the outskirts of Fort Salem. 2 of the strike team that were guarding Sarah took off after them without needing to be told to do so. Petra frowned at the incoming far speech report, turning to meet Sarah's eyes. They're retreating. Sarah shook her head. Something isn't right. The Camarilla don't retreat, and they certainly don't launch a half-assed attack like this. Maybe they realized they were outnumbered and didn't stand a chance, Petra offered, but even as she said it, she didn't sound like she believed her own words. No, Sarah said, eyes flicking around the base. This doesn't feel right. General Bellwether, one of the soldiers from the strike team spoke up. Isn't that cadet from your daughter's unit? Both Sarah and Petra turned in the direction the strike team member was pointing. Raelle Collar was sprinting towards them both at full speed. Her hair was matted by the rain, Sarah's rain, and there was a nasty cut on her forehead above her eye, dripping blood onto her face. She was shouting something, unheard by the sound of Sarah's raging storm, but Sarah's stomach clenched at the desperate, pained look on Raelle's face. There was a long, deep cut on her leg as well, pants ripped and soaked with both blood and rainwater, but she didn't seem to notice. General! Her anguished voice was finally audible to Sarah and Petra as she drew closer. General! Raelle! Petra immediately stepped forward, worried. She put her arms out, all but catching Raelle as she stumbled into them, doubling over with a gasp. Raelle, you're hurt! Raelle ignored Petra, pushing away from her, her wild blue eyes landing on Sarah, who was frozen with both concern and confusion. Sarah! The sound of her first name being used by the cadet had Petra's eyes flicking to Sarah in fear and confusion. Raelle took a step closer to Sarah, and Sarah noticed the tears in her eyes mixing with the rain that was still pouring down her face. Sarah, she sobbed. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Sarah reached out, gripping Raelle's shoulders tightly. Collar, what's wrong? What happened? Another sob ripped through Raelle, and she shook her head helplessly. We tried to stop them. We couldn't. There were so many, Sarah, Another sob. They took her. All the blood drained from Sarah's face, and she suddenly felt dizzy, like if she moved too fast, the world would be pulled out from under her. Fear froze her in place, the anger and rage in her veins instantly evaporating. Took who, Raelle? She already knew the answer, knew there was only one person that would cause Raelle to have this sort of reaction, to call her Sarah. But she had to. needed to hear Riel say it anyway. Riel's mouth opened in a silent sob, and when she did speak, her voice sounded absolutely broken. "They took Tally."
Please find the fanfiction you just listened to on Archive of Our Own and leave the author some love. Without them, this wouldn't be possible, and we want to thank them from the bottoms of our hearts for creating these amazing stories and keeping the show alive.